Okay, I think we can begin. If you're ready, we are. Good afternoon. My name is Eugenia Gusilov. I'm the director of the think tank Romania Energy Center, and I'm truly excited to welcome all of you to the first lecture given at Bucharest University by the renowned American professor, John Mearsheimer. The event is part of our ROEC Bucharest Talk series, which aims to bring the biggest authorities in the world of international relations in dialogue with the Romanian public. Today's lecture is organized in partnership with the Department of International Relations and World History of the Bucharest University, and I hope it will open a new chapter in the cooperation between independent think tanks such as ours, ROEC, and the Romanian academia. Also, I couldn't be happier that this lecture takes place here, especially since I, myself, am an alumni of the Bucharest University. So, to all of you, the young people in the audience, I will say just this. Enjoy every minute of today, because when I was a student 15 years ago, such opportunities did not exist. So with this, I invite Dr. Manuela Dobre, the head of the Department of International Relations and World History of Bucharest University, our main partner for this event, to join me in welcoming you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, first of all, it is my pleasure to extend my warmest thanks to Professor John Mearsheimer for having accepted our invitation to visit our Faculty of History and make a presentation which already stirred a great interest among our students. I would like also to show my appreciation to our partners, ROEC, especially Eugenia Gusilov and Eliza Gheorghe, in organizing this event and acknowledge their contribution in making this outstanding happening possible. I think having Professor Mearsheimer at this podium is a very rewarding endeavor, which is both elevating and beneficial, and making our department a very special place where the most appreciated opinions on international relations can be heard and assessed. Thank you very much, and now for a few words I give the floor to Professor Stan.
Thank you. It is my honor to introduce Professor John Mearsheimer to our academic community here at the Faculty of History, University of Bucharest. There are lots of words to be spoken when addressing a personality of this magnitude. Everyone can learn about Professor Mearsheimer by simply clicking on the internet. That is why I will limit myself only to essentials. By so much more since the good people gathered here are very much willing to hear from our guest, not from me. It is sufficiently enough to mention a few books which helped shape the world's understanding regarding the dynamics of international relations. Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, or the Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy. There are also a lot of articles and studies published in well-reputed magazines of international relations, which left the mark of undisputed expertise and often predicting some developments, future developments, in the international security environment. I can remember as far back as 1990, a famous text by Professor Mearsheimer, Back to the Future, Instability in Europe after the Cold War. Well, among other things, the message of this article laid emphasis on how ethnicity and ethnic nationalism would surface at the end of Cold War in this part of Europe. And many leaders in the Balkans for many leaders in the Balkans, this message went unheeded. And guess what? The Yugoslav Federation is no longer with us. The demon that made it vanish being precisely the one identified by Professor Mearsheimer at the dawns of meager democracy in this part of Europe, hyper-nationalism. As a realist, Professor Mearsheimer teaches us about the old order of realist discourse that has been in place for at least 12 centuries. He tells us in international security as far back as 1994, 1905, the winter of that year. He tells us about pleasant surprise of being intellectually more at home in Beijing than in Washington. Benign hegemony. Because Chinese scholars and Chinese policymakers tend to favor realism more than their counterparts in America. Well, Professor, I wish you could say the same thing when addressing a Romanian audience, because Professor Mearsheimer goes as far as saying, it is good to be back among my people when addressing a Chinese audience. Again, I wish you could say that addressing a Romanian audience, but make no mistake, when you're going to address a public audience in this country, we will address an idealist gathering. Because, you know, here in Romania, people are told every day by the leaders that, for example, mighty America will come to our rescue whenever those bloody Russians dare attack us. According to most celebrated ironclad Article 5 of the Treaty of Washington, which spells the Musketeers' principle. An attack on all is an attack on one, and the other way around. An attack on us is an attack on everyone. Well, our beloved leaders, of course, never read that article. And that is why everyone here is so anxious to hear a presentation, sir, on NATO in the age of Trump administration. So I would conclude saying that it is high time for us, Professor Mearsheimer, to get insulated with a few drops of our realism serum. Thank you for being here with us this evening, and Godspeed with your presentation, sir.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I would like to thank the Romania Energy Center and the University of Bucharest, in particular, the history faculty, for inviting me here to speak. And I want to thank all of you for coming out to hear me talk today. As I often say when I address audiences like this, it's very humbling to realize that so many people are interested in what I have to say. And I will go to great lengths to make it worth your while to be here on a beautiful Wednesday afternoon instead of outside enjoying the sunshine. The subject, of course, of my talk is the future of NATO in the age of Trump. And this is the basic outline of my talk. I want to start with 3 background points, just 3 general points that you want to keep in mind as I work my way through the talk. Then I want to talk about the history of NATO, I don't think most people in the audience know a whole heck of a lot about the origins of NATO and how it evolved during the Cold War and even in the post-Cold War period. And then I'll go to the heart and soul of my talk, which is NATO in the age of Trump. Background point number one. It's very important to understand that the United States is the most secure great power in the history of the world. It just doesn't get any better from a security point of view than the situation that the United States has. First of all, there's the geography. The United States is separated from all of the other great powers in the world by two giant oceans, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And for any country to attack the United States, they have to cross either the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. We have neighbors like Canada and Mexico, which are incredibly weak and would never think about attacking the United States. As I like to say, if you think about American security, we have Canadians to the north, fish to the west, Mexicans to the south, and fish to the east. That's just the geography. Then there's our power. We are, as you all know, an incredibly powerful country. Two building blocks of military power are population size and wealth. We have a huge population and we are incredibly rich. And during the post-Cold War period, we were the sole great power, the only great power on the planet. Unipolar moment, one great power, that was the United States. And then finally, we have thousands of nuclear warheads, and nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. So just think about the United States in the post-Cold War period. We're separated from the rest of the world by two giant moats. We have no great power rival because it's the unipolar moment, and we've got thousands of nuclear weapons. Tell me, does it get any better than that? No. Second point you want to keep in mind, and I'll re-emphasize this later on in the talk, has to do with American grand strategy. Outside of the Western Hemisphere, outside of our backyard, there are three areas of the world that we care about. Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Not the Middle East, the Persian Gulf. Those are the three areas that most American policymakers believe are so important that we are willing to expend large amounts of blood and iron. Why do we care about Europe and Northeast Asia? Because those are the two areas of the world where the other great powers are. Northeast Asia had Russia / the Soviet Union, Japan, China. Europe, of course, had Napoleonic France, Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. And the Persian Gulf, we care about that area, not because there are any great powers, but that's because the oil is there, and oil really matters. So those are the three areas that matter the most for the United States. And of course, Europe is inextricably bound up with NATO. Third point you want to keep in mind, and this will become clear as we go along, is that there are differences between the foreign policy elite in the United States and the American public regarding how to think about foreign policy. The foreign policy elites in the United States tend to be more interventionist than the public. And this gets back to my very first point. Remember what my very first point was. The United States is a remarkably secure great power. Most Americans don't care about foreign policy because we're a remarkably secure great power. It just doesn't matter very much. We're not like Romania that lives in a bad and dangerous neighborhood surrounded by countries, historically, they're much bigger. You, public here in Romania, tends to pay a lot of attention to foreign policy, certainly much more than the United States. And it's because of geography. The elites, however, the foreign policy establishment in the United States really cares about the whole subject of America's role in the world, and it is very ambitious in terms of what it wants to do around the globe. Okay. Second part of my talk, I want to talk about the history of NATO. And when we talk about the history of NATO, we're really talking about the history of the American commitment to Europe. That's what really matters here. You take the Americans out of Europe, NATO is kaput. The reason you want to keep the Americans in Europe is because that's the way to maintain NATO, and virtually every country in Europe that is now a part of NATO wants the American security umbrella over their head. So when we talk about the history of NATO, this is the history of the American commitment to Europe. Let's talk about three periods. Before NATO was formed in 1949, and this is the period from 1900 to 1949. You all understand that in 1900, the United States finally established regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. As a result of the Spanish-American War in 1898, we were finally the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. So I want to talk about US foreign policy towards Europe from 1900 to 1949. And of course, 1949 is when NATO is formed. So the Cold War NATO is 1949 to 1989. And then I want to talk about post-Cold War NATO. And then I'll go to the age of Trump. Okay? So I want to give you a sense of how Americans thought about Europe before NATO's formed in 1949. The United States was an isolationist country from 1900 until 1917. When Woodrow Wilson ran for president in 1916, he campaigned on the slogan, "I kept us out of war." There was a lot of opposition in the United States to entering World War I. The United States actually enters World War I in April of 1917. Okay, it's our first major foreign policy engagement abroad. First time that we really use large-scale military forces. The Americans had over 2 million soldiers, in France by the time the war ended. 50,000 Americans died. So it was a sizable commitment. First commitment of military forces to Europe. The war ends, as you all know, November 11th, 1918. In fact, the 100th anniversary is coming up soon. We immediately pull all the combat forces out of Europe, and we leave a small occupation force. And then in January 1923, President Harding pulls that small occupation force out of Europe. So there's no American commitment to Europe after 1923, right? So it's from April 1917 when we get into 1923. Then come the 1920s and the 1930s. And as you know, the United States was a thoroughly isolationist country. Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The United States did nothing. Hitler invaded France on May 10th, 1940. The United States did nothing. Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And then, thank goodness, Franklin D. Roosevelt said, on December 11th, 4 days later, the Germans declared war against the United States. That's what got us into World War II. Roosevelt, dealing with isolationist America, could not get us involved in what was happening here in Europe when Hitler was on a rampage. It was not until after Pearl Harbor, when Hitler foolishly declared war against us, that we entered the war in Europe. Very important to understand this, because what you see is that the Americans, this is before we had nuclear weapons. This is a world where there are lots of powerful states in the system, like Germany and Japan and Russia / the Soviet Union. The United States had a very powerful isolationist impulse. And again, it's because we are a remarkably secure great power. That's why Romanians, Danes, Germans, other Europeans worry about us going home, right? And the basis of that isolationism is the fact that we are so secure, right? But anyway, we get involved in World War II, and we play a major role, the Americans, in defeating the Germans. But of course, it's the Soviet Union that plays the key role in defeating the Germans. Very important to understand that. And when the war ended, the Soviet juggernaut was in the heart of Europe. But the Soviets and the Americans were allies. We had fought together with the British against Nazi Germany. So when the war ends here in Europe in May of 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union are allies. Question is, what are we going to do? You know what we wanted to do? We wanted to come home. We did not want to stay in Europe. We're certainly not going to stay in Europe with large-scale ground forces. We're coming home. And by the way, we had not yet defeated Japan. Japan is not defeated until August 1945, so we were going to pull those forces out of Europe and send them to fight against Japan, which we thought at the time we would have to invade. We thought that was going to involve huge numbers of forces. But more generally, we had no interest in staying in Europe. We had no history of staying in Europe. America is a deeply isolationist country at the time. But the problem is we face a potential peer competitor in Europe. That's the Soviet Union. Because as I told you before, the Soviet Union played the key role in defeating Germany. And it was sitting there with all that military force in the middle of Europe. And my third point here is that the West Europeans were not in a position to contain the Soviet Union. Germany was in ruins. France had been occupied between 1940 and 1945 by the Germans and was in terrible shape. Britain was badly damaged by the war. Its economy was hurt. Plus it had this huge empire that it had to manage, which limited its capacity to influence events here in Europe. So the United States had no choice but to stay in Europe. You understand that in the late 1940s, remember NATO's formed in 1949, we were not anxious to stay in Europe. We were forced to stay in Europe because the Soviet Union was a potential peer competitor in Europe, which is the most important area of the world for the United States at that point in time. We care about Europe. We do not want any single great power dominating Europe. Then the question becomes, who's going to contain that European power that might overrun the place? And the answer is, there's nobody to do it. So we have to do it. So Uncle Sam, also known as Uncle Sugar, decides to stay in Europe. What exactly does that mean? Actually, at the beginning, NATO was very weak militarily. When the United States pushed for the legislation from Congress to create NATO, there was huge resistance among the elite. And when Dean Acheson and others were pushing to create NATO, they were not emphasizing the importance of putting military forces in Europe, because they knew that the American public would have little appetite for that, and large chunks of the American elite would have little interest in doing that. Slowly but steadily in the 1950s, we begin to build up our military forces in Europe. But the Eisenhower administration, and you all know Eisenhower is in power from January 1953 until January 1961. President Eisenhower wins 2 terms. President Eisenhower is actually very interested in getting out of Europe and turning over containment of the Soviet Union to the West Europeans. We want to resurrect German power in the form of West Germany and get the French, the British, and the West Germans to contain the Soviet Union so we can go home. So you want to understand that impulse to leave Europe, it's been there for a long time. Then come the Kennedy years. And President Kennedy, of course, is assassinated in November of 1963. But before he's assassinated, he basically sets in stone the American commitment to Europe, right? Kennedy decides that all this talk about leaving Europe doesn't make sense. We should commit ourselves to staying in Europe. But what happens in 1965 is the United States goes into Vietnam. And this is a catastrophic war. You cannot imagine the extent to which it tore apart the United States. It was just horrible, right? There was so much opposition to the war, and we did so poorly in the war, right, that what happened was we began to talk about pulling back from all over the world, right? We began to talk about pulling forces out of Korea. This was the Nixon doctrine. And there was a lot of emphasis in greatly reducing our commitment to Europe. This is the famous Mansfield Amendment, which is all about reducing the American commitment to Europe. And this is a consequence in large part of the Vietnam War and the fact that the American public, and even large chunks of the elite at this point in time, are fed up with all these military commitments around the world. The Mansfield Amendment is defeated in Congress, and the United States stays in Europe. Then comes 1975. This is very important. And I put a star next to 1975, and I refer to the period from 1975 to 1989 as the golden years. This is when the American foreign policy establishment becomes firmly committed to NATO. Note here, I'm not saying the American public, right? I'm saying the foreign policy establishment in 1975 becomes firmly committed to NATO. Now, what happened there? It's very simple, because I started graduate school in 1975, and I can tell you the mindset, and it influenced my initial research in graduate school. Vietnam War ends in 1975. Vietnam War basically runs from 1965 to 1975. When the Vietnam War is over with, the last thing the United States wants to think about is intervening in another country in the third world with military force. So what we do is we focus laser-like on Europe. Europe becomes the center of attention for people who study strategy. The foreign policy establishment says, let's think about Europe. Let's not think about another Vietnam. Foreign policy establishment at that point in time becomes firmly committed to Europe. No more doubts, no more Mansfield Amendment. And from that day up to the present, you're dealing with a foreign policy establishment that is firmly committed to staying in Europe come hell or high water. It's very important to understand that. Talk about the post-Cold War period. I remember just on the golden years, I put the golden years 75 to 89, right? But then down bottom I said the commitment remains unchanged. So now we're in the post-Cold War period, right? This is the period that you are familiar with, because I would imagine that almost everyone here was born in the post-Cold War period. What happens here, very interesting. First of all, when the Cold War ends and the Soviets pull out of Eastern Europe, which is wonderful news for Romania, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic. When the Soviet Empire in Europe comes to an end, the Soviets, in the form of Mikhail Gorbachev and his lieutenants, get together with the Americans to talk about the future of NATO. And I don't know if you know this, but the Soviets want the Americans to stay in Europe, and the Soviets want NATO to remain intact. And the main reason is that the Soviets, like you, understand that the Americans are the pacifier. But unlike you, the Soviets are not worried about themselves, they're worried about the Germans. And what they like is the idea of Uncle Sam staying in Europe, keeping NATO intact, and keeping the Germans down. We used to say during the Cold War, I'm sure many of you have heard this fancy phrase, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. The Soviets are now out. So the name of the game, from the Soviet point of view, is to keep the Americans in and keep the Germans down. And by the way, the Germans like this arrangement. because the Germans are afraid of themselves. The Germans don't like to look at themselves in the mirror. Ah! Right? So the Germans go along with this. And by the way, the Germans are not reunified at the time. East and West Germany are not reunified, and they know if the Americans are there, and the Soviets and everybody else is not fearful of what the implications are of German unification, it'll take place in a relatively smooth way. And of course, that's exactly what happens. But it's very important to understand that what the Soviets do not want under any circumstances is NATO expansion. They do not want NATO moving eastward, which makes perfect sense from their point of view. They do not want this alliance that was their adversary from 1949 to 1989 marching towards their border. So they want NATO to remain intact, but they want it to stay in place. The second point is, this is the era of unipolarity. The United States is the sole pole, the only pole. We're the dominant state on the planet by far. Right. But this is a period where we abandon basic realpolitik and we adopt liberal hegemony. And you're saying to yourself, what exactly is liberal hegemony? We decide, and I'm going to talk about this in the context of NATO expansion, we decide that what we want to do is we want to expand this liberal order that we created in Western Europe to include Eastern Europe. What we want to do is we want to bring you Romanians into the EU. We want to bring you into NATO. We want to make sure that you're a vibrant democracy. We want to make sure that you're hooked on capitalism. We want to make sure that you're part of the West. And what we want to do is take NATO, the EU, these institutions we created during the Cold War, and we want to move them eastward. And I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but it is true. We did not move NATO eastward to counter a potential Russian threat. That was a story we invented after the February 22nd, 2014 crisis in Ukraine started. In fact, you can go home and Google Madeleine Albright, go home and Google Michael McFaul, right? Prominent Americans who dealt with Putin, who told Putin on numerous occasions that NATO expansion was not aimed at containing Russia. What we were doing instead was trying to create a giant security community based on liberal principles that enclosed or covered the entire European continent, right? The idea here was that if the continent was covered by nothing but democracies, they were all embedded in international institutions, and they were all part of an open international economy, that we would all live happily ever after. To put it in terms that you would understand, we would have peace, love, and dope. And this was the idea. Right? The idea was not to move NATO eastward for the purposes of containing the Russians. That's the basis of NATO expansion. And of course, there are two big expansions. The first one is in 1999. This is when Poland comes in, the Czech Republic comes in, Hungary comes in. And then the second big wave of NATO expansion is in 2004. And that's when Romania, the Baltic states, and a number of other countries come into NATO. Okay? The Soviets, then the Russians, did not want NATO expansion. And from the mid-1990s forwards, the Russians screamed bloody murder about NATO expansion. But they could not do anything about it, and they were not willing to do anything about it. Then comes the 2008 Bucharest Summit. This is when the trouble starts, right here in Bucharest. When the summit is over with, NATO issues a decree which says unequivocally that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. It was impossible because of German opposition, and to a lesser extent, French opposition, for NATO to address that issue during the actual Bucharest Summit. Nevertheless, the Americans insisted when the summit was over with that this decree be issued, which said that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. The Russians had had enough with NATO expansion. They went ballistic. And they basically made it clear that a red line had been drawn in the sand. And there was going to be no more NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. Not surprisingly, in August 2008, remember the Bucharest Summit here, Bucharest, April 2008. In August 2008, not surprisingly, you have a war between Russia and Georgia. Because Georgia is operating under the illusion that it can get tough with the Russians, and the Americans and the West Europeans will protect them because we intend to bring Georgia into NATO. But of course, the West Europeans and the Americans do nothing, and Russia wins the war against Germany. Then the second big crisis comes in February 2014, February 22nd, 2014, to be exact, and you end up not only with a war in the eastern part of Ukraine involving the Russians, but the Russians take Crimea. This is all a result of the Bucharest Summit, and it's a result of the fact that NATO expansion went too far. My next point to you is this is the return of realpolitik. This is why you hear all sorts of Romanian politicians, American politicians, NATO politicians saying that Russia's a threat, we have to do this, we have to do that. It's a fundamentally different world than existed before February 22nd, 2014. If you look at the Cold War, let's say 1947 to 1989, realpolitik across the board. 1989, Cold War ends, up to 2014, liberal hegemony. After 2014, realpolitik returns. This is the world that you all have been brought into over the past 4 years. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but you want to understand that what else happens in the 2000s is that you get the continuing rise of China, and you get the resurrection of Russian power. China really begins to get integrated into the international economy that the United States created during the Cold War with the help of the Europeans and its Asian allies. The Chinese start in the early 1980s, and in the early 1990s, when the Cold War ends, the Chinese are beginning to grow at a rather impressive rate. By 2005, 2010, China looks like it has the potential to turn into a real gorilla. And not only that, the Russians come back from the dead. I don't know how many of you know this, but in the 1990s, Russia was in absolutely horrible shape. The end of the Cold War was a disaster for the Soviet Union, then Russia, right? And they had remarkably little military power. Their economy was a wreck. Putin comes to power in 2000, and from that point forward, the Russians slowly begin to claw their way back. And this is why we say today we're moving from a world of unipolarity to multipolarity. Multipolarity, China, Russia, and the United States. That's the post-Cold War world in a nutshell. This brings us to NATO in the age of Trump, okay? And I think there are two ways of thinking about where NATO is headed, okay? The first is to focus on Donald Trump. He's the force driver here. He's the person who matters. Do you want to know what's going to happen to NATO? And virtually everybody in Europe cares enormously about this because you all understand that the United States is the pacifier. Okay, and you do not want the United States to leave. So you then, if you focus on Trump, believe that it is this one person who's now in the White House who is really sui generis. Truly, truly amazing politician. whether you like him or not, right? And I don't like him. I did not vote for him. I want to be clear on that. But he is, you know, a force to be reckoned with. You all understand that, of course. He's a force to be reckoned with. And the argument here is, if you want to understand what's going to happen in NATO, you focus on Trump. The second way of thinking about where NATO is headed is not to focus on Trump. He's, to put it in Marxist terminology, he's superstructure, right? Doesn't matter that much. In this case, you focus on the rise of China. You focus on the structure of the system. Okay? And what I'm going to do here is make the argument that don't pay much attention to what Trump says. He's not that important. What really matters is the rise of China. Okay? If you want to think about the future of NATO. So let's start with Trump. As you know, Donald Trump said during the campaign that NATO is obsolete. And this summer he came to Helsinki and he put on a performance that just drove European policymakers and large chunks of the European public crazy because of his overt display of contempt for NATO and for Europeans more generally, right? I like to say, Donald Trump has never seen an institution that he didn't intensely dislike, right? I mean, it's really quite amazing. The head of the EU, or one of the heads of the EU, a few months ago identified President Trump as one of the greatest threats to the EU's future, right? This is really quite remarkable. He hates the EU. He hates NATO. He hates the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, NAFTA. We've done away with NAFTA and come up with a new agreement. One of the first things he did in office, and this was remarkably foolish, is he killed the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which made eminently good sense for trying to contain China, but he killed it. He just does not like institutions at all. And also, as I say down bottom, he doesn't like allies. Really, it's fundamentally different view than the foreign policy establishment has about our European allies. They're not just allies, they're friends. But for Trump, the whole concept of allies is rather meaningless, right? And with regard to you Europeans, he thinks you're a bunch of free riders, right? You're riding on their backs, right? You don't pay enough money for defense, and you're counting on us to defend you. Well, sorry about that. You defend yourselves. You think the Russians are a threat? You defend against the Russians. You've got enough people. You've got enough GNP. You can build the military forces to deal with Russia. I'm going to do nation building at home. That's what really matters, right? So you can spin a story where President Trump, because he's the President of the United States, can do some amazing things. And by the way, you all understand that in America today, Congress is not a meaningful check on the presidency. We live in the era of the imperial presidency. If Donald Trump wants to start a war next week against Iran, he can do it. He wants to start a war against China, he can do it. I mean, he has tremendous freedom to maneuver on the foreign policy front. So here we're talking about a situation where you have a president who has a lot of power, and as I told you before, this guy's sui generis. He's really a quite remarkable politician, never to be underestimated. That man who intensely dislikes NATO and has contempt for our allies, one might think could cause a whole heck of a lot of trouble. My view is he can't. And the reason he can't is that the foreign policy establishment in the United States, or what's sometimes called the Blob, we call the foreign policy establishment the Blob, loves NATO. Remember my point to you about 1975? Remember I said to you from 1975 to 1989, that was the golden age, right? And then I said to you from 75 to 89, all the way to the present, the foreign policy establishment's love affair with NATO and Europe was locked in. This means that it's Trump against the Blob on NATO. And the question is, who are you going to bet on? On this issue, I'd bet on the Blob. Not on every issue. I think Trump will beat the Blob on a number of issues. One could argue that Trump will fundamentally reorient American foreign policy in certain ways because he'll beat the Blob, because he is sui generis. But I think on the NATO issue, that's not true at all. I think the American elite is so committed. And the problem that Trump has is he has hardly any allies. One of the problems that both Barack Obama and Donald Trump had when they entered the White House is that they could not find many foreign policy advisors who agreed with their views on foreign policy. Now you're saying to yourself, why is John talking about Barack Obama? We understand Donald Trump. What you have to understand is that Barack Obama got elected on the platform that America was too deeply involved overseas. And to use Barack Obama's words, we had to do more nation building at home. Barack Obama was one of the few prominent politicians who opposed the Iraq War. Barack Obama did not have hawkish instincts. He did not share the foreign policy establishment's view that it's our responsibility, our right to run the world. You know Madeleine Albright's very famous statement, America is the indispensable nation. We stand taller, we see further. You know, as I like to say about Madeleine Albright, she's never seen a war she didn't want to fight, right? And she thinks it's our responsibility to run the world. Barack Obama, like Donald Trump, ran against that. And this is my whole point to you about public opinion in the United States versus elite opinion. Barack Obama got elected and Donald Trump got elected. But what happened to Barack Obama is that the Blob beat him. He admitted this in a very famous interview with Jeffrey Goldberg of the Atlantic Monthly a few months before he left office. For those of you who haven't read this interview and who are interested in the subject, you ought to Google it and read it. Obama basically admitted the Blob beat him. Blob is very powerful, very powerful. Trump is a different matter. Trump, I think, can beat the Blob on certain issues. But the point I'm making to you is I don't think that Trump can beat the Blob on NATO because the Blob is just so deeply committed to NATO, which is good news for you because, as you all know, from virtually every European country's perspective, Romania included, keeping the Americans in Europe really matters. So this, bottom line, Trump is unlikely to ruin NATO by himself. This brings us to China. In my humble opinion, this is the real threat to NATO. And here's the basic story. I'll give you the details in a minute, but I just want to give you the basic story because I like to sort of signal where I'm going to take you before I take you there. Basic story is rise of China is going to present the United States with a potential peer competitor. And that potential peer competitor is in Asia. And the US is going to have to go to extraordinary lengths to contain it. Because the Chinese have a lot of people, they have a lot of wealth. And with that large population and with all that wealth, again, if they continue to rise, we're going to have our hands full containing the Chinese. We meaning the Americans. Dealing with that threat will require enormous resources and cause the United States to pivot to Asia in a serious way, which means pivoting away from Europe. You all understand that when you pivot to some place, you're pivoting away from another place. And remember I told you there are three areas of the world that matter, right? One is Europe, another is East Asia. We're going to pivot out of Europe to Northeast Asia or East Asia more generally to deal with the Chinese threat. That's the basic story. So let's unpack this a bit more. Talk about the rise of China. We're moving into a multipolar world. I've made this point to you clear before. United States, China, and Russia. I'm not going to talk about Russia Because despite the resurrection of Russian power, and despite all the paranoia in Eastern Europe about the Russian threat, Russia's not much of a threat to Eastern Europe today, and it's a declining great power. It's just not that big a threat. The real threat, certainly from an American point of view, is China. Right? So what you want to think about is the relationship between the United States and China. Because what I want to try to show you is that it's easy to imagine a situation where China grows so powerful that we basically have to pivot out of Europe. Key building blocks of power, as I said before, size of population and wealth. For all you realists in the room, right, what you want to do when you want to assess, what the world looks like, look at individual countries, you just ask two questions. How many people do they have and how rich are they? The United States is a real gorilla for two reasons. It's got a lot of people and it's got a lot of wealth. When I was your age, China had a lot of people, but it did not have a lot of wealth. Therefore, it was not considered a great power. Back in the day, the Soviet Union had a lot of people and it had a lot of wealth. It was a great power. Right? Those are the two questions. You look at a country like Sweden, a country like Israel, these are countries that have a lot of wealth, but they don't have enough people to be great powers. Nobody would ever say Israel's a great power. Nobody would ever say Sweden is a great power. Just don't have enough people. Right? You've got to have a lot of people and a lot of wealth. United States. It is and will remain a remarkably powerful country. Here's the population figures. U.S. population, 2015, we have 322 million people. Probably today we have about 325 million. It's projected that we'll have somewhere around 389 million people in 2050. So we have a population that's growing. And with regard to our economy, one of the most vibrant economies in modern history. And it has its ups and downs for sure. But the American economy is not to be underestimated, as you know. Here are some of the key figures. This is China versus the United States. And remember, we're talking about looking at size of population and wealth. You've just seen the population figures for the United States, but I put them up there for purposes of comparison. There's the Chinese population. Today we have 325 million. Chinese population's probably around 1.39 billion. That's a huge difference. It's a huge difference. Even though the Chinese population decreases a bit by 2050, that's a consequence of the one-child policy, right? They still have 1.35 billion people compared to our 389 billion people. What about wealth? If China today had Hong Kong's per capita GNI, it would have a GNI, that's gross national income, of $48.4 trillion, compared with the US gross national income of $15.1 trillion. All of this is a way of saying that if China becomes a giant Hong Kong, it would have 3 times the gross national income of the United States. 3 times. If China today had South Korea's per capita GNP, or GNI, right, it would have almost double the GNI, gross national income, of the United States. Just to drive this home, this is the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union had roughly the same size population. Same size population. The Soviet Union had at most 1/3 the wealth of the United States. At most, 1/3 the wealth. We're talking about a situation here where China in 2050 will have about 3.5 times as many people as the United States, and somewhere between 2 to 3 times as much wealth. Just think about that. Think about the United States in the Cold War. We had our hands full dealing with the Soviet Union. We had the same size population as the Soviet Union and 3 times the wealth. We're talking about a situation here where we're dealing with an adversary that has 3+ times as many people as we do and has, let's say, 2+ times as much wealth as we do. And we're taking them on 6,000 miles from the California coast. To get into China's backyard from the California coast is 6,000 miles. Huge power projection problems, right? We're going to be doing everything we can to contain China. It is really going to be a tough task. Again, we're assuming here that China continues to rise economically. So the key question for the future is, can China rise peacefully? My answer is no. China can't rise peacefully. My argument is that China is going to try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. I believe you can already see evidence of this. I believe they'd be crazy not to. I believe if Romania had a lot of people, a lot more people than it now has, and it had a lot of wealth, you'd try to dominate Europe. You'd be crazy not to. Looking at Romanian history, how many of you think it was a good thing that Romania has been weak relative to its neighbors? You think that was good? Or would you have rather run Romanian history again with the tables turned and Romania is by far the most powerful state in the region? This is not even an interesting question. The biggest problem you faced over centuries is that you're too weak. You want to be really powerful, and you want to dominate your region of the world, because then nobody else will threaten you. That's one of the luxuries of living in the United States. We are Godzilla. Do you think I go to bed at night worrying about Canada attacking us? Do you think I go to bed at night worrying about Guatemala attacking us? Of course I don't, because we're so powerful. Wouldn't you Romanians want to be in a similar situation here in Europe over time? Of course the answer is yes. Well, do you think the Chinese are different than the Americans or different than the Romanians? No, they're not. The Chinese talk about the period from the 1840s, late 1840s to the late 1940s, as the century of national humiliation. Why was it a century of national humiliation? Because they were weak. And the Japanese and the Americans and other Europeans and the Russians took advantage of them. They want to be really powerful. They want to be by far the most powerful state in Asia, and they want to push the Americans out of Asia. And I don't blame them one bit from a Chinese point of view. But then again, I don't represent a Chinese point of view. I represent an American point of view. And we Americans have no interest in letting them dominate Asia. Right? Nor did China's neighbors, for the most part. There's some exceptions like Laos and Cambodia, maybe Myanmar, who will be on China's side. But most of China's neighbors will be with the United States and will go to great lengths to contain China. And the end result is that we'll have a security competition between China and the United States that's not altogether unlike the security competition we had between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. You blame the Soviets, by the way, for wanting to dominate Europe? You blame the Soviets for staying in Germany after World War II? After what happened to them? Right? The Soviet Union was definitely interested in dominating Europe. I don't blame the Soviets. It's the best way to survive. You think it made sense from a Soviet point of view, after defeating Germany in World War II, to go back home, let Germany reunite, and then we could have World War III, do it again? Remember, the Germans, World War I, Germans, World War II. Russia/the Soviet Union fought the Germans in 2 world wars. They wanted to make sure that there was no resurrection of German power, and that the Soviet Union was by far the most powerful state on the planet. This is the basic logic here. But again, the point I'm making to you when we're talking about China is that we're dealing with a country that has a lot of people and a lot of wealth. And for us, meaning the United States and our Asian allies, to contain China is really going to force us to work overtime. It's going to require a lot of resources. I've given you this story, okay, about why China will try to dominate Asia. Okay, what are the implications of China's rise for Europe and for Romania? I said to you in the beginning, when the United States thinks about the world, there are three areas that matter: Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. The United States has always considered Europe to be the most important area of the world. It's because that's where the most powerful states on the planet were located. That world has gone away. Very recently, but it's gone away. East Asia is now the most important area of the world, the United States by far, followed by the Persian Gulf, and I'll explain why in a second, and Europe is a distant third. Europe is no longer that important to the United States. I believe, just to make it very clear here, I believe we'll stay in Europe because the foreign policy establishment is committed to NATO. But the argument that I will make is that if we have to pivot to East Asia, we'll leave Europe. And the reason we'll leave Europe is Europe's just not that important from a strategic point of view. Okay, what about the Gulf? Why do the great powers care about the Persian Gulf? The Gulf accounts for roughly 30% of the world's oil supply, roughly 30%. And the Gulf accounts for roughly 55% of the world's oil reserves. All that's to say that there's a lot of oil in the Persian Gulf. And who controls that oil matters a lot to the great powers. And it especially matters to the Chinese. Just think about this. In 2015, China got about 25% of the oil that it consumes out of the Persian Gulf. And most estimates are by 2035, the Persian Gulf is expected to account for about 54% of Chinese oil. This is to say the Chinese are going to be militarily involved in the Persian Gulf. The Chinese will tell you behind closed doors that they are building a blue water navy, and that blue water navy is designed to protect the sea lanes of communication between the east coast of China, East Asia, and the Persian Gulf. They're very interested in power projection. They're very interested in building a blue water navy. Go home and Google Iran and China. You'll see the Chinese and the Iranians are beginning to move closer and closer together. And there's a strategic dimension to that. The Chinese are going to be big players in the Gulf. The United States is a big player in the Gulf, and the United States is going to remain a big player in the Gulf. So what I'm telling you is East Asia is of enormous importance because that's where China is physically located, right? And furthermore, the Gulf is of enormous importance because it's inextricably linked to Chinese security. Europe is number 3. And this is why NATO might be in real trouble down the road. First of all, there's no potential hegemon in Europe. We're worried about East Asia today because of China. It's a potential hegemon. It's a potential peer competitor. There's no potential peer competitor in Europe. Germany is depopulating. You all understand that today Germany is by far the largest country in Europe. By the year 2050, because the Germans don't make babies in large numbers anymore, Germany is going to be roughly the same size population-wise as Britain and France. So the idea that Germany is going to dominate the continent, not going to happen. Russia, I know people in Romania worry greatly about the Russian threat. It's a declining great power. It's depopulating. Its economy is in terrible shape, and it's not going to improve in any meaningful way in all likelihood. They're not going to dominate. And furthermore, the Russians, I believe, are going to be worried about the Chinese. Second point, China's a potential peer competitor that will rival the US and East Asia and the Persian Gulf. There's the Gulf and East Asia. And then my final point, and this is really very important. Europe and China are likely to have good relations. And Europe cannot help balance against China. You just want to think about these points that I'm raising to you. Europe and China are likely to have good relations, especially economic relations. You Europeans will have very powerful incentives to trade with China and to get rich, to get prosperous. That makes perfect sense from your point of view. The last thing you want to do is pick a fight with the Chinese. And to the extent that you think the Chinese might be a threat in the future, let the Americans deal with the Chinese. Let the Asians deal with the Chinese. Why would you want to deal with them? You want a buck pass to us. Makes perfect sense from your point of view. But furthermore, and this is my last point on the slide, you can't help us balance against China because you have so little military power. And you certainly don't have any meaningful power projection capability. The idea that you're going to build military forces, European states are going to build military forces and then send them out to East Asia to help us contain China? This is not a serious argument. So you're not going to be any help to us. And in fact, you're going to be trading with the Chinese. And I wouldn't be surprised, especially with regard to the Germans and even the French, that you will trade dual-use technologies with them, i.e. technologies that the Chinese can use for military purposes. This will really antagonize the Americans. So again, there's my list of strategic interests. East Asia and the Persian Gulf are 1 and 2, and Europe is number 3. So here's my bottom line. President Trump is not the greatest threat to NATO's future, despite his obvious contempt for NATO and for our European allies more generally. And again, my point is the American foreign policy establishment is too deeply committed to NATO to allow Trump to dismantle it. But the American public's enthusiasm is more tempered. But I think in the long run that doesn't matter. I think it's the fact that the Blob will beat Trump that takes the Trump argument off the table. The greatest threat to NATO is the rise of China, because as I've said to you before, if China continues to rise, we are likely to swing out of Europe, which would lead to the demise of NATO. Therefore, Europeans, to include Romanians, should hope that China does not continue its impressive rise. Thank you. I will gladly take questions, but we have one minor technical issue that does have a solution, and that is that we don't have a microphone that we can pass around. And the talk and the questions are being live streamed. So what I would ask people to do is ask one simple question, 2 at the very most, and then what I'll do is I'll repeat the questions so that everybody in the audience knows for sure what the question is, or questions are, and people who are watching via live stream will also know what the question is or are that I'm answering. So with that thought in mind, if people just raise their hand and I'll call on you. Sir, can you stand up, please?
Yes, I will. So you are still sort of. The big question is, why hasn't the U.S. pursued NATO extension through the reunification of Romania?
Why hasn't
the U.S. pursued NATO extension through the reunification of Romania?
Okay. His question is, why hasn't the United States pursued NATO expansion to include reuniting Romania with Moldova? Okay. I think the answer is quite simple. First of all, the United States does not want to change borders in Europe or really any place else on the planet if it can possibly avoid that because of the precedent. So the United States is almost axiomatically opposed to an idea of that sort because it obviously involves changing borders. The second point I would make is when you're talking about Moldova, you're right on Russia's doorstep. And the United States is not interested in picking a fight with the Russians over Moldova. You will notice that when Russia went to war against Georgia in August of 2008, the United States did not come to the defense of Georgia. You will note that after February 22nd, 2014, when the Ukraine crisis broke out and you had a war in eastern Ukraine and the Russians took Crimea, the United States did not come to the defense militarily of Ukraine. All of this is a way of saying that the United States does not see it as being in its strategic interest to fight wars with Russia on Russia's borders. And I think that trying to incorporate Moldova into Romania would really be asking for trouble, and the Americans simply aren't going to do that. Yes, ma'am.
Professor Mearsheimer, thank you for being here. My name is Delia Nitzel. I am a worker for human rights NGO, and I'm a PhD candidate at this faculty. I know that in America, military women and men are highly respected, as they should be, because they're the ones willing to give their lives for the safety of others. And as a graduate of West Point and former officer in the US Air Force, you will know, of course, that soldiers are respected also because they're the guardians of freedom and the American way of life. And by American way of life, we at least understand the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So in this context, Professor, I ask you, how is it possible, after 2 years from his election, for Americans to still have Donald Trump as president? Is it no longer self-evident that all men are created equal, regardless of their race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender, age, women and children, sir? How is it possible? Is the elite no longer performing checks and balances? Because I heard you say that the Congress, you can no longer count on it. You co-funded him, you presented him with irony, but you see
You have to shorten your question because remember, I have limited memory capacity.
Because you are a superpower, and here in Europe, sir, we've seen that before the Second World War. And we can treat Donald Trump with irony, but because you're a superpower, we ship yourself. So how is it that he's still your president?
This is a question that focuses on President Trump and why he is still in power, despite the fact that he has what I think the questioner quite correctly identifies as illiberal tendencies. The United States is a thoroughly liberal state, as she pointed out, and we place a very high premium on individual rights or inalienable rights. And as you well know, inalienable rights means everybody has those rights. I think there's no question that President Trump has powerful tendencies that are anti-liberal or illiberal for sure. I think that his comments about Muslims and his comments about Mexicans, just to pick two examples, are, from my point of view, unacceptable, and they fly in the face of basic liberal values that most Americans cherish. But the problem is that he was elected President of the United States. And that means that there were a lot of people who either shared his values or were willing to overlook his illiberal tendencies for other reasons. And the problem that you face in any liberal democracy is that when someone is elected to be the president or the prime minister for, let's say, 4 years, it makes eminently good sense to let that person remain in office for 4 years unless he or she commits an impeachable offense. And President Trump has not committed an impeachable offense, and therefore he will remain in power. Now, there are checks and balances on him. As you know, the midterm elections are coming up in the United States. And people who are deeply upset with President Trump's policies have an opportunity to go to the ballot box and elect a whole heck of a lot of Democrats in Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. And if that were to happen, that would be a serious check on his power. And it is possible that somewhere down the road, should you have a Democratic-controlled House and a Democratic-controlled Senate, that he would be impeached. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just saying it could possibly happen. But the bottom line here is he was elected president, and that's why he will, in all likelihood, remain in office for 4 years. And I might note that lots of people who don't like Donald Trump at all, think that there's a reasonable chance that he'll be reelected in 2020. Sir.
Hello, so my name is Valentin. So I have a question. Do you think maybe the survival of NATO is evidence of a weakness of realist theory and maybe of evidence in favor of liberal institutionalism, for example? Because you are right, many using theorist analysis, we would have expected that NATO would wither away, and it did not. So maybe institutions and what states are important actors in international relations.
Yes. The gentleman's question went like this. Do I think the fact that NATO has continued to exist after the Cold War is evidence of a failure of realist theory? Because one can easily explain the existence of NATO during the Cold War based on realist theory, but once the Soviet Union goes away, one would expect NATO to go away as well for good old-fashioned realist reasons. I think that there are different realist theories on whether or not NATO should have continued when the Cold War ended. I think the fact that NATO continued after the Cold War ended contradicts my theory of realism. My theory of realism predicted that NATO would have collapsed after the Cold War. Obviously, NATO did not collapse. Therefore, my theory is wrong, okay? I have a good number of realist friends who believe that for realist reasons, the United States should remain in Europe, East Asia, and the Persian Gulf forever to prevent war from breaking out. Okay? That's not my theory. That's their theory, right? These are what are commonly called selective engagers. They believe that the United States should stay in those 3 areas of the world forever. And the fact that we have stayed in Europe and maintained NATO from their point of view, which is a realist point of view, makes perfect sense. So it all depends on whose theory of realism you're talking about. Okay?
Sir, I'd like to ask you if you change your assessment on the power of Europe should it build its own common army.
This gentleman's question is, would I change my assessment of Europe's capability if it built its own common army? Let me answer that by saying, if it built its own common army, In other words, if there was a European army, a real European army, right, I would change my assessment. But, I know you were waiting for that but, but I do not believe that Europe is going to build a real common army. And the reason is that I think to do that, you would have to have meaningful political integration in Europe. You would have to have a United States of Europe. And I believe that what you have here in Europe is a group of nation states that have formed a very powerful institution called the European Union. But it's just an international institution. It's a very impressive international institution, but it's an institution that's comprised by individual nation states. Like there are Romanians, Germans, Italians, Greeks, right? And there's no common foreign policy. There's no common political system, right? You all have your own political systems, right? There are a lot of similarities for sure. And I think there is zero chance that there will ever be a United States of Europe. And it's because I believe that nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. And it's an ideology that focuses on the nation state. And all of these nation states in Europe are not going to voluntarily join together and do away with their nation states.
Hello, my name is I finished Master in Diplomacy and Security. And I wanted to say that you are basically saying that foreign policy establishment in the United States want to still commit to NATO, but also there is very important to pivot towards Asia because in order to contain China, or future growth of China.
Right.
And I'm thinking it's not just a theory or something that just Trump embraced, President Trump embraced. Their foreign policy establishment thinks about it too. So how do they want to balance these two? Still maintain the commitment toward NATO and move practically their capabilities to Asia, to contain China.
Okay.
How can they balance it? Do they have a strategy?
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. This young woman said she accepts my basic framework that the foreign policy establishment is deeply committed to Europe. And of course, that same foreign policy establishment will have to pay attention, serious attention, to containing China. And the question is, how does the foreign policy establishment balance those two tasks? In other words, maintaining the commitment to Europe and at the same time containing China. My answer to that is, I think the foreign policy establishment, and here we're talking about the United States, will go to great lengths to contain China. That will be the #1 priority. And at the same time, it will go to great lengths to keep troops in Europe to maintain NATO. So it's not like they're going to want to undermine or sabotage NATO. On the contrary. But my argument is we may reach the point where China becomes so powerful and the demands on the United States to contain China are so great that we basically have to move almost everything to East Asia and we have to give up on Europe. Not because we don't like the Europeans, but because there's no threat in Europe that justifies us being there. And this threat, the threat of a potential peer competitor, especially one that could be as powerful as China, really scares us in major ways. So this is why I say, it's not just China growing more powerful, to get at the essence of your question. It's not just a matter of China growing more powerful, it's a matter of China growing really powerfully, into a really powerful country, growing especially powerful, that would, I think, undermine NATO. Oh,
Ms. Mearsheimer, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I had a question about the long-term implications of some of the policies that the Trump administration has adopted, and primarily the checks or the fact that he proposes closing the gate of immigration to the U.S. So the numbers you gave us about that phenomenal increase in U.S. population, I wonder if those numbers were before Trump came to the White House, because if he's stopping the flow of people to the U.S., then he's basically killing the golden goose. The goose has laying its own eggs. So, to what extent is Trump actually now undermining U.S. power by preventing legal and illegal immigrants from getting to the U.S.?
thank you. Do I have to repeat that question, given that she was speaking into a microphone? I should repeat it. Okay, I'll repeat the question. This young woman says that if you look at America's demographic trajectory, which has long been very impressive, it's not simply due to baby making, it's also due to immigration. And you all know that is the case in the United States. Immigration has been of enormous importance in the growth of the American population over time. And of course, it's quite depressing. This is another aspect of President Trump that bothers me greatly. It's quite depressing to see how committed he is to shutting off immigration as much as possible. And her point is that if President Trump succeeds in cutting off immigration, won't that slow down the growth in the American population over time? And won't that undermine American security, because I said that the size of your population really matters? I think that there is no question that if he were able to shut the door completely or almost completely on immigration, and he was able to do that for a long period of time, it would do damage to the United States' position in the world. I think that we depend heavily on immigrants. Immigrants have helped make America great, and we would be remarkably foolish to shut the door almost completely for a long period of time. But I don't think that that's going to happen. I think that there will be a short period of time where immigration is under serious threat. But I think over the long term, the American economy is too dependent on immigration to not reopen the sluice gates. There are just all sorts of jobs in the United States that Americans won't fill. And one of the principal reasons we had so much immigration from south of the border was people came into the United States from the south of the border and took jobs that Americans wouldn't take. I would also note, and this will be my final point on this subject, a lot depends on how many children Americans have. In other words, if to have replacement rate, just to maintain the size, steady state of your population, an American woman, the average American woman has to have 2.1 babies. That's replacement rate, 2.1 babies per woman. And that number has dropped way down in recent years. So if you don't have any immigration into the United States, the American population is going to shrink. If that continues, and I don't know whether it will continue, I think there's a good chance it will continue. If that continues, I believe they'll open the sluice gates on immigration, right? But I can't say that for sure. Let me just say just a quick word about immigration into the United States, because I've spent a lot of time studying this, and it's actually a fascinating question. The myth about America is that it welcomed immigrants and it loved immigrants, and it was a melting pot from the beginning, and this was all part of the liberal ideal. That bears little resemblance. That story bears little resemblance to what actually happened. the United States let immigrants come in huge numbers because it really had no choice. First of all, immigrants started coming to the United States in large numbers in the 1830s. There were 5 big immigrant groups that came out of Europe between roughly 1830 and 1924. Those immigrant groups were Germans, the largest immigrant group to come to the United States. Germans, Irish, Italians, Jews, and Poles. Germans, Irish, Italians, Jews, and Poles. Anyway, the main reason they came and they were let in between roughly 1830 and the American Civil War, starting in 1861, was just to fill up the country. We started as 13 colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, and we marched across North America to the Pacific Ocean. We conquered this huge piece of real estate, and we didn't have people to fill it. So we let immigrants in to fill the country up. After 1865, the Industrial Revolution began to hit really hard in the United States, and we needed workers. We needed people. So we continued to let immigrants in. The first time that we really shut the gates was in 1924. We shut the gates in 24 and did not open them again until 1965. You want to think about that. That's 1924 to 1964. Immigration into the United States was severely restricted, not unlike Donald Trump wants to do. And then in 65, the gates were opened again. And from 65 up to the present, huge numbers of immigrants have come in, right? But I would say to you, and the point I'm trying to make to you is a lot of this has to do with necessity, right? If the American birth rate begins to go down, right? If the American birth rate begins to go down, the necessity of bringing in immigrants goes up. And I believe they'll open the doors again. One final point on this, and I don't mean to get too carried away here. If you look at American women who have babies, right? A large chunk of the baby making is a result of recent immigrants having babies, right? So if you shut the gates in any meaningful way, you would expect a rather serious decline in baby making inside the United States, which creates an incentive to bring in more and more immigrants. But I think just as a general principle, forget all this stuff. I want to make it very clear. From my point of view, immigrants are a wonderful thing. And if smart Romanians or Romanians who are really ambitious want to come to the United States, I said, my view is you're welcome. We can use all the smart and talented people we can get.
Thank you, sir. My name is George. I'm a freshman at the University of Bucharest, the Faculty of Political Science. I'm studying international relations and European studies, and actually just moved back from the US 4 months ago. I have 2 questions for you tonight. The first one is, if Trump will damage the US-EU relations even more, is there any way for them to be completely refixed by the next US president? And the second one, it's more like an internal one. Is there any way for the Congress to impeach Trump after the upcoming November elections? Thank you.
Okay. 2 questions. His first question is, given the fact that Trump has done some damage to US-EU relations and will probably do more damage in the years ahead, the next couple of years, is there any way that damage can be repaired? And then his second question was, is there any possibility or any reasonable chance that President Trump would be impeached after the midterm elections? With regard to your first question about Trump and EU relations, I would say that a lot does depend on how long he's president. If he's president for 4 years, that is somewhat different than 8 years. One could make an argument that he would do enormous damage to US-EU relations if he was in power or in the White House for 8 years. I think even if he's in the White House for 8 years, there are limits on what he can do there. Because I think, as I told you, the Blob is committed to NATO. It's not anywhere near as committed to the EU, but those two things are not unrelated. And I find it hard to imagine that he would do so much damage that it couldn't be repaired, okay? So I think that, you know, whoever succeeds President Trump, whether it's in 2021 or in 2025, could do a lot to repair the relationship. But again, you want to remember my argument is that US-European relations are largely going to be driven not by who's president, but by the rise of China. With regard to your second question, I think I answered it for the most part in response to this young woman over here, and that is, I don't think that even if the Democrats win both houses, that at this point in time there's reason to think they would impeach Trump. And I think if they tried to impeach Trump, it would not be good for the American body politic. I mean, I think there has to be good reason to impeach Trump. When I was young and Richard Nixon was, he did not end up getting impeached because he resigned before he would have been impeached. But one of the reasons that Richard Nixon resigned was not because the Democrats were ready to impeach him, but because the Republicans, Richard Nixon's own party, had turned on him. So I think with regard to Donald Trump, if you're going to impeach him, he has to do something that is really a clearly impeachable offense that causes enough members of his own party, i.e. the Republican Party, to join with the Democrats to impeach him. And I think if the Democrats by themselves were to try to impeach him, and they had the votes, you know, they controlled both houses of Congress, but the Republicans to a person were opposed, this would have disastrous consequences for American politics. So I see it. This is not to say that there aren't circumstances under which he could be impeached, right? They may find evidence of some misbehavior or some crime at some point in time. But absent that, and we have no evidence of that at this point in time, absent that, I don't see him being impeached.
Thank you, Mr. Professor. My name is Blob. I am a student at the Political Science Faculty of the National School of Political Study and Public Administration. I have two questions for you. First, about your presentation. I watched it with great interest, but I have one amendment, if I can. You mentioned that the 2008 Bucharest Summit and the invitation that Ukraine received to join NATO was, in retrospective, a direct cause of the 2014 Russian occupation of Ukraine. But don't you think that the main cause was the fall of President Viktor Yanukovych, and which gave President Putin the feeling that he may lose his hold on Ukraine, that pushed him to order the occupation of Crimea? And second, in relation to the relation of the US with Europe with a common army, I want to ask you if you can see any possibility that NATO can be reshaped not as an alliance of the US and the individual states of the EU, but as an alliance of the US and of the European Union. I mean, something of a common security policy.
Okay. His first question had to do with the Ukraine crisis, and he pointed out that I emphasized that NATO expansion, especially the decision here, or not the decision, the decree here in Bucharest in April 2008 that said Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO, was not really what caused the crisis. What caused the crisis was the toppling of Yanukovych, who was the president of Ukraine on February 22nd, 2014. So it's the toppling of Yanukovych, not NATO expansion, that caused the crisis. Let me answer that, and then I'll go to his second question. There's no question that the toppling of Yanukovych was the precipitating event, right, of the crisis. But let me tell you how I think about how Western policy led to the Ukraine crisis. My argument is that our goal was to make Ukraine and Georgia part of the West, okay? And to make Georgia and Ukraine part of the West, let's focus on Ukraine. We did three things. One, NATO expansion. Two, EU expansion. And three, the Orange Revolution. Okay, there's those three things together. And my argument is that the real key to alienating the Russians was NATO expansion. I believe that if there had been no NATO expansion and it was just EU expansion, that it would not have caused a major crisis with the Russians. I think the Russians would have been willing to live with EU expansion into Ukraine. It's NATO expansion plus EU expansion plus the Orange Revolution. It's those three things together, all designed to make Ukraine and also Georgia with the Rose Revolution part of NATO. Now, the crisis in February 2014 that I've talked about a number of times, as this gentleman points out, was precipitated by the overthrow of Yanukovych. But the crisis actually started over EU expansion. It was not over NATO expansion, it was over EU expansion. So in a way, you could say what happened in February not only had little to do with NATO, it was EU expansion plus the Orange Revolution, which is linked with the overthrow of Yanukovych. I do not disagree with you that it was the overthrow of Yanukovych that precipitated the crisis. But the fact is that the deep cause of the crisis was the attempt to make Ukraine part of the West, to make it a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. And that involved NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the Orange Revolution. And the real key was NATO expansion, right? This is why, have you ever asked yourself, why did Putin take Crimea? There's no evidence that he was thinking about taking Crimea before February 22nd, 2014. Right? Why did he take it? Because his great fear was Yanukovych would be overthrown, a pro-Western leader would be installed in Ukraine, Ukraine would jump into bed with the West, and Sevastopol, which is a Russian naval base historically, and was being basically operated as a Russian naval base, but only with a lease from the Ukrainian government, would become a NATO base. This is not going to happen, right? This is not going to happen. So he took Crimea, in my opinion, to make sure that Sevastopol remained in Russia's hands, and it didn't fall into the hands of NATO. So I have no problem with your point about the importance of Yanukovych being overthrown on February 22nd, but I would put it into a broader context and emphasize the importance of NATO expansion. Now, his second question was, could NATO be transformed where you have an alliance between the United States on one hand and an EU military capability on the other hand? And I think that's not going to happen because you already have NATO, and why would you want to fool around with NATO? Why is creating an EU military capability a good thing? What does it do to make the West's military capability any more robust. I don't think it does much of anything. The other thing is, and I don't want to get into this in any detail at this point in time, the EU is in political trouble these days, and it's not clear that the EU can get its act together and create a common military force that could ally itself with the Americans. I think if you're interested in keeping the Americans in Europe, you don't want to fool around with the existing NATO structure. Just leave it in place. This woman right here? No, I'll get you next.
Thank you, Professor. So you used an official statement of Madeleine Albright to argue that NATO was not standing for Central and Eastern Europe to counteract the Russian aggression.
Yes.
Nevertheless, the Central and Eastern states were joining NATO to take shelter in the case of a foreign/Russian aggression, and they were accepted. NATO said yes, you are okay to join the alliance. So do you see here a contradiction between what NATO is saying and what NATO is doing?
Yeah. Her point, which is a very interesting point, is that NATO, according to me, is interested in expanding eastward, not to counter the Russians, right? Not to form a military alliance against Russia that prevents it from conquering Eastern Europe. It's pursuing a policy of liberal hegemony. However, she says, the East European countries like Poland and Romania that are joining NATO view NATO as an alliance that will protect them against Russian aggression, which is in opposition or contradicts what I was saying about what NATO is up to. I think you're absolutely right that the countries in Eastern Europe were thinking in realpolitik terms. My point to you is that the people who were driving NATO expansion in the West, and that includes the United States and the West Europeans, were not thinking about it in realpolitik terms. They didn't view Russia as a serious threat. You want to remember, I mean, this may not seem plausible to you, but you want to remember that, first of all, in the 1990s, Russia was not a serious military threat to Eastern Europe. And you ought to spend a little time thinking about what Russian military deployments looked like in the western military districts of Russia on February 22nd, 2014. There are hardly any Russian forces in the western districts. Russia does not present a threat to Eastern Europe in February 2014. We're not worrying about a Russian attack into Eastern Europe. I know the East Europeans worry about this because it's in their DNA, right? I understand that. And I'm not, if I were Romanian or Polish, it would be in my DNA, right? I have the luxury of having grown up in the most secure great power in the history of the world. You don't. But what I'm telling you is NATO expansion was driven by the likes of Madeleine Albright. You should just go home and Google Madeleine Albright's views on NATO expansion as a threat to Russia. Right? And my final point, just in response, is you do not want to underestimate what a thoroughly liberal country the United States is. And how, at the end of the Cold War, when we were the unipole, we were in a position, right, to spread liberal democracy and the American way of life with a West European way of life around the planet, or at least we thought we could do that. Somebody had a question here. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. First, I'd like to studying the Isolationist and European studies. I would like to ask you about Euroscepticism and how it affects Europe today. And the second question would be,
No. What's the first question?
how does Euroscepticism affect?
What is Euroscepticism?
It's in British accent, it's skepticism. I say that skepticism instead of skepticism.
I'm just not sure what your question is.
Tensions of Europe right now at the actual moment. The political nationalism and the separatist sentiment of France, Italy, and Great Britain at Gulf of Italy.
Okay, and you want to know how that...
Yes, how it affects Europe today, and what would be the chance of the emergence of an alliance of states of Europe? Not a common army, but some sort of alliance.
Okay, so his question is, there's a lot of Euroscepticism here, which I interpret to mean skepticism about liberal values, about the EU, and skepticism about the way business has been conducted in Europe for decades now. And you see, for example, the rise of nationalism and assorted other problems. And, what does this all mean? I think that it's quite clear that huge numbers of people in Europe are deeply dissatisfied with the existing order. I think Brexit is a manifestation of that. The EU, which looked like it was going to last almost forever, and where it was hard to imagine Britain leaving, is now in a situation where Brexit has been voted up and Britain is going to leave the EU this coming March. This is really quite remarkable, and this tells you that a huge chunk of people in Britain were deeply dissatisfied with the EU. And you see in places like Hungary and in places like Poland a significant movement towards illiberal liberalism, getting back to the woman's question from before about Donald Trump. This is not restricted to the United States. You're beginning to see these sorts of attitudes taking place in the United States as well as Europe. So I think there is a great deal of Euroscepticism in the air, and the question you have to ask yourself is, where is this headed? I think the Euroscepticism is only going to grow with the passage of time. I think dissatisfaction with the European Union is only going to grow with the passage of time. I think one of the problems that you face is that you have really marked economic inequality in countries all over the world, and people who are not doing well economically are willing in many cases to turn to right-wing parties, and they're willing to vote against the EU for one reason or another. And I think that there's no evidence that the elites have a solution for these problems. And I'm just not very optimistic about the future of the European Union for that reason. I'm not arguing that the European Union is going to disappear, but the European Union is in trouble, and I don't see any evidence that anyone has a solution for fixing it. And by the way, that's especially true with the Eurozone, right? The Euro is, been a cause of significant problem in recent years, and we don't really see any way of fixing that. And I think you could even have more economic crises based on that factor. I'll take one more question from this gentleman, and then can you just talk a little bit louder?
What is the role of the United Nations organization in this global problem?
So the question is, correct me if I'm wrong, what is the role of international organizations? Oh, what is the role of the United Nations? Okay, so that's the question. What is the role of the United Nations in dealing with global problems? Okay. The United Nations is basically a toothless and ineffective institution. It always has been, and it always will be. And the reason is that the great powers set up the United Nations so that each great power had a veto in the Security Council, which is the key decision-making body. Each great power could veto a particular policy decision if it didn't like it. So during the Cold War, if the United States wanted to do something and the Soviet Union didn't want to do it, the Soviet Union would veto it, and vice versa. So the only time these countries can work through the UN is when they agree. But if they agree, they don't need the United Nations. You would expect them to go to the United Nations and get help at the United Nations when there's a disagreement. And you could sit down and have a vote, and somebody loses and somebody wins. But in the Security Council, you can't lose because you have veto power. So the United Nations has never been very successful in dealing with international problems. And there's no reason, given that you have the veto in the Security Council, that that's going to change. One final point. The United Nations was created at a time when the balance of power was very different than it is today. And the Security Council does not reflect, in my opinion, the distribution of power around the world. I think there are countries like India, countries like Japan, countries like Germany, the need for a Muslim state. There's no Muslim state like Turkey in the Security Council. There's no country like Brazil in the Security Council. So there's no South American or Central American country represented. You basically have a Security Council that reflects the balance of power in 1945. And we are in the year 2018. And if you're going to create a Security Council today from scratch in 2018, it would not end up looking anything like the present Security Council. So if you have any hope of making the United Nations more effective, if you have any hope of that, you have to have a Security Council that's more reflective of the real balance of power in the world. And you're not going to get that. Chinese are not going to let the Indians get a seat on the Security Council. Right? And I could go on and on. It's just not going to happen. And my initial point to you, which is really the key point, is even if you had a new Security Council, it really doesn't matter, because then you just have more countries that have veto power. So if we increase the present Security Council from five permanent members to, let's say, 9 permanent members, then you have 9 veto-wielding states instead of 5. So all I would say to you, I say this with a certain element of sadness, if you're counting on the UN to solve serious international problems, you're going to be sadly disappointed. I just want to say thank you very much for all coming out.